Hi everyone and welcome. We're down here at my wormery, and today I was going to spend a little time prepping a new worm farm. And if you look back there on the background, there's the shelf full of different tubs, and on the right over there in that frame there's even a bag. Different types of systems that have different types of worms in them, all doing the same thing. They're all composting down my kitchen scraps and my household waste. Anything that's compostable, for the most part, gets given to the worms, and what you're left with in the end is some really wonderful compost that can be given to the plants in your garden or to the plants that you might have in pots or whatever the case may be. Before I get started though, I figured I'd give everyone a quick rundown on the different stuff that I plan to use for this, and those things are all laid out here on the table for the most part. So let me walk through everything here for you really quick so you can see what I've got in store for today. I've also got a little checklist over here of the items that I'm going to include in today's build of my worm farm or worm bin. And one of the things that the list begins with is, as you can imagine, a container to do it in. So off in the distance you saw that there's a variety of different containers that you could choose from. Most people try to use a tub of some sort, a plastic container that's more or less waterproof. Some people have perforations in their bin to allow for the moisture to escape. Other people don't. It's kind of a preference thing. The bag that you see on the right over there within the frame is a type of system where the compost actually gets ejected at the bottom. So you put the food scraps and anything that's to be composted into the top, and out comes the finished compost on the bottom after you've given the worms time to chew through everything. So I'm going to be selecting some sort of a bin to use for this, probably a plastic tub like what you see up on the shelf over there. And then we're going to begin laying in some materials. But how do we begin? So let's skip back to the checklist here. You'll see that right after the container on the checklist, I've included the word bedding. Now, bedding is really just some sort of a carbon-based material. And when I build this bin today, I'm going to be using a variety of different types of bedding. And those are the things that you see out here. You could use cardboard. And here I've got a bunch of tubes that were either paper towel tubes or toilet paper tubes, all turned into little rings to give everything some good airy structure. Here I've got a box full of leaves that came out of my leaf collector bagger. It's all nice and crushed and small little bits of leaves here. And another thing that you see over here in this yellow container is a bunch of newspaper bits. Newspaper bits that I actually crumbled up so that they don't lie against each other and get all matted together. So these are the things that I was going to use as bedding for the build of this bin. What are all these things over here? This pile of brown stuff, this tub full of scraps of who knows what. Even a little baby jar full of what? Some sort of a white powder? What is that? Well, that leads us to the next item on the list, which is the food. And as you can imagine, the food could be pretty much anything. Any sort of kitchen scraps that you could think of, and in this case, we're going to be feeding them stuff like a banana peel, some carrots that went bad, as well as some peelings from carrots. There's all kinds of stuff in here. In here you'll even see the peels of some oranges. Some people will tell you not to compost high citrus or high acid materials because it could cause problems in the bin. I tend to follow a little bit more of a no rules kind of an approach, and as long as you put things in, even like that, in small amounts in moderation, it shouldn't be a problem. Now here, I'm actually using this material here, which is coffee. This is just used coffee, but I'm actually using the coffee to colorize this piece of wood here. But I figured before I feed it to the worms, I would use it for this purpose. So I'm using it sort of as a wood stain right now, but I thought it looked kind of interesting all laid out here on the table before we dump it into the worm bin. But for now, that's pretty much all I'm going to be using to build the bin as far as food is concerned. And that's going to lead us to the next item on the list, and that is the grit. So the grit is what the worms need in order to digest their food. And you know, you could use stuff like pulverized eggshell, which is what I have here in this jar. And you could use pulverized seashells, you could use sand, whatever you have on hand. Some people even just go out in their garden and grab a handful of dirt and use that as the grit in their bins. That's just as good. So whatever you choose to use as grit in your worm farm, the important thing is that it's small enough to fit into the tiny mouths of the worms, and as you can imagine, their mouths are really small, so you want to make sure your stuff is nice and finely ground. Now, the thing that you see hanging off that yellow tub over there, that little squeeze bottle, is going to be the way that I'm going to be applying moisture, which is the next item on the list. And in most cases, if you take measures to prevent the loss of moisture in your bin by maybe keeping the bin covered up, then a lot of times you can preserve the moisture that's in the bin that gets introduced through the foods that you add just by keeping things covered up. In other cases, you might have a system that actually is exposed to the air a little bit more than is necessary, and you might have to compensate for that evaporation by adding moisture. So when we're building this bin, in order to get a lot of this dry material that we're using as bedding nice and damp, we're going to be using the squirt bottle to get it nice and hydrated before we put in the next layer. So that leads us to the final item on the list. And you might have already peeked ahead, so you might already know that the next and the last item that I'm going to talk about is referred to here as microbiology. And what might that mean? A lot of people actually overlook this item, and I kind of think that's a little bit of a mistake, because a lot of people take a fairly freshly built bin, all kinds of nice bedding and food and all kinds of nice materials that they've just built a bin with, but the bin is completely sterile. So the worms get introduced into an environment where the material in the bin has not really had a chance to break down at all. And the worms really do rely pretty heavily on the microorganisms that live in the bin alongside them to kind of give the food that they're going to consume a jump start and break stuff down. So one of the best things to use, if it's available to you, is simply some of your finished worm castings, or your worm manure, or worm poop, whatever you want to call it. And that stuff is chock full of all the materials that you need to get a bin started, all the little bacteria and microorganisms and fungi, and all the things that are really going to get the bin off to a terrific start. So the last thing that we're going to be adding into this bin after we've built it is a little bit of an inoculant, a little bit of microorganisms in the form of some finished compost out of here. And in fact, I'm looking at this stuff that's piled up here on top. We've got ourselves a couple pieces of paper and cardboard stacked in here, which are really serving no purpose anymore. So I might actually end up recycling these as well, put them into the worm bin that we're building, and it's going to come along with a bunch of bonus material here, which is a little bit of mold growing, just something that the worms really like. And you'll see some more of it growing down under here. So I think this material here in itself, if it were used in the bin, would actually serve as a really good inoculant for the bin as well. So with our checklist complete, I think we've got the information and knowledge we need to proceed with the build of the bin. So let's get started. Alright, so now the selection of your bin is clearly a personal preference, and I like to use these containers which are known as bus bins. It's the sort of a container that you see used in restaurants for clearing tables of all the soiled dishes and utensils. They're good, tough, lightweight material bins. They're a good capacity. I believe there's something in the neighborhood of about 7 gallons. If you're using one of these types like mine, which is about 7 inches deep from top to bottom. I've also got a couple of the types that are a little bit shallower, but I find that having the deeper ones obviously provides more capacity, but it also provides a little bit more room to work in when you're shifting things back and forth. So I always like to use bins that are about this size. As you saw earlier when I touched on the topic of containers, there was that bag in the corner, the Vermi Bag Mini. It's a fairly good sized container, and it's not even the biggest bag that's out there. In fact, it's one of the smaller sized bags that are out there. So in terms of capacity of the container, you can go really big as you like, But for me, I think that the major appeal of a container this size is that I can pretty easily lift it, even when it's almost full. And yet, you'd be actually quite surprised at how heavy worm castings are. The worm compost becomes extremely, extremely heavy. You'd be quite surprised. So, I have, in fact, gone pretty small even in the past. I've gone so far as to use containers that are about this size, which is just a little, little tiny bucket. It's maybe, I don't know, maybe a gallon, maybe not even in size. I would say that something about this size is maybe the smallest that you would want to go, because you do want to give the worms a fair bit of space to be able to move around. And one of the important features is giving them a good amount of surface area on the top as well. Because a lot of the worms that you use for composting are the type of worms that like to feed on the surface. So making sure that you've got a container that's maybe a little bit larger in terms of surface area versus tall and narrow might actually be of a benefit. It's probably the reason you see a lot of people using open big containers of this sort and maybe not so much 5-gallon buckets. That would be another option, certainly usable, but it would limit you on the amount of surface area that you would have on top to use. So now it's important to keep in mind that the materials that I'm using here are just examples of the stuff that you could use. You could use pretty much anything that you have around. So this is just one form of cardboard. If you have cardboard boxes, you could tear them up into little pieces. Whatever it is that you have on hand. If you have a shredder comes in really handy to help break down all types of paper and cardboard materials into a nice small size. But around my house, the toilet paper tubes start to pile up, and every time I visit my mom, she always gives me her paper towel tubes and toilet paper tubes. So I've always got a steady supply of this type of cardboard on hand. I've also got other types of cardboard coming in the form of packages and boxes, so there's other types of corrugated material. This cardboard is not corrugated. This is just a single layer of cardboard, but most boxes have this sort of wavy material in between two flat layers of cardboard. This is what's referred to as corrugated cardboard, and this provides a lot more material in a small space, and it's all terrific material to use as bedding in your worm bins. So now I've used these circular and oval pieces of cardboard as my base because I kind of like the way they provide a little bit of aeration. Even if it's laying down flat like this, it doesn't lay completely flat. No matter how it's resting on the ground, it always seems like it's going to provide a certain amount of aeration, which I like in the beginning. I know eventually the stuff will all get broken down and it'll collapse and compress. But in the beginning, I like to try to provide a good amount of airflow throughout the material for my worms. So I almost always begin with these types of tubes, but it's always very important every time you start into a worm bin build and you're using materials that start off dry to include a little bit of moisture to make sure that they're going to be nice and damp. So that's why I've got my little squirt bottle here on hand. In my area, the water comes out of the tap with a fair amount of chlorine in it. Most people will advise you correctly to give the water that you're putting into your worm bins a chance to air out a little bit, because the chlorine that's dissolved into the water will eventually evaporate if you give it time. So if you have a way to allow the moisture in the water that you're going to be putting into your worm bins to first just sit around for a little while, then that's always beneficial. Obviously, if you've got a barrel outside in which you collect rainwater, then that could be used as is. That's always probably the best. And eventually, I'm going to be covering this thing up with a material like plastic or something that doesn't allow for the moisture inside to evaporate. So even though there's going to be little water droplets down on the bottom, that stuff will all eventually start to try to evaporate, make its way throughout the other materials in the bin, and the entire contents will eventually nicely equalize as far as moisture is concerned. So now with all these little voids and gaps and everything throughout this material, I like to try to start filling that in a little bit. Even though there's going to be good airflow in there, there's certainly not a need for that much. So that's when I think a good, fairly fine material like these shredded pieces of leaves would come in as a good sort of intermediate layer to spread inside of here to fill in the blanks in a way. So I like to sprinkle a little bit of this stuff in now. And here again, this is just my preference. A lot of people might use an entirely different selection of materials depending on what they've got on hand in their particular area. And something that I really don't have in my area, since I live in a suburban environment, is manure. A lot of people do, though, have horse manure or rabbit manure or different types of manure on hand, which they could use as the bedding for their bins, and that stuff works great. And that's stuff that the worms really like. So if I had it, I would use it, but I don't. So unfortunately I can't, but I just figured I'd mention it, because if you are lucky enough to have those sort of materials on hand, then I would definitely suggest using them. But you would also want to take into account the fact that that stuff has the potential to heat up and start composting on its own. So you don't want to create an environment that's going to start heating up and composting on its own, because that could make the environment just way too hot for the worms, which you don't want to have happen. So as you will normally hear when you hear people talking about the best way to use manure in your worm bin, is to use the type of manure that's been around for a while and has had a chance to age, and then it has you know, no more potential of heating up and causing harm to the worms. So now I've got other materials here that I didn't really include earlier in my little demo, and this is coffee filters, right? So you'll recognize them. They're just these round coffee filters, and every time I reset the coffee machine, I not only do I put the coffee grinds aside to give to the worms, as you saw demonstrated earlier with all those coffee grounds that are resting on that piece of wood, I also take the filters and I set them aside to be used in my worm bins as well, because it's just paper, and you know, all this paper comes in really handy when it comes to setting up your worm bins. And all I really did here was create a little bit of a platform for the oncoming additional layers that'll follow. And it's at this point, now that I've got a couple layers of cardboard, leaves, paper, that I can start thinking about, hey, maybe it's time to start introducing some of the food that's going to go into that bin. And that's a great idea. So why don't we begin by sprinkling in the food items that I bought down here. The food items, as I showed you earlier, are just a variety of kitchen scraps. And in my case, some of it is pretty fine, small chopped stuff, such as these carrot peels. So they're almost small enough and bite-sized enough to be considered as worm food. And then there's other things in here, such as these banana peels, which are pretty much whole the way they are. And I'm not really going to go out of my way too much to prepare the worm food. The one thing I will do, though, is, if you haven't noticed, this stuff is actually frozen. And some people will tell you that there are certain benefits to freezing the foods that you give to your worms. For me, I think the main benefit is that I can have this stuff, you know, sitting around for a while before I get around to using it, without it, you know, starting to spoil and become foul within the kitchen. And there's another benefit that some people will tell you, is that after something has frozen and thaws out again, the material is sort of semi-broken down at that point, at the molecular level, at the cellular level. And I'm not a, you know, microbiologist or a chemist or anything like that, so I'm not sure if I'm using the right words. I'm just kind of repeating what I've heard on the web, and I think what I've heard people mention is that you're basically rupturing the cell walls of the material that you're going to be feeding to the worms by freezing it. And by doing so, it enables for the infiltration of all the microorganisms, the bacteria, the fungi, and everything that's really going to help the food get a good jump start, so that the worms can eventually eat it. Because I think it's a little bit of a misconception that what you're giving the worms is something that they really like, and they're really just going to eat it right away themselves. I mean, certain things I believe they will. They'll be able to just go right there and probably start eating the banana, maybe watermelon, other really soft, damp, moist foods. But for the most part, the stuff that the worms are going to consume requires a little bit of time for the the microorganisms in the bin to get a foothold in them and start breaking it down and start decomposing it before the worms can actually follow through and start eating the food themselves. So that's going to take us back to the microorganisms for the microbiology ingredient. Hand in hand with the food is something that you want to include pretty regularly, and that's the grit. Because the grit, this really fine substance, is the coarse stuff that the worms are going to make use of in their gizzards. So if you've heard the word gizzard, gizzard is the equivalent of what we as humans have as a stomach. Gizzards are a slightly different type of stomach. In a human being's stomach, you have acid, which breaks the food down, but in a gizzard, such as in a worm's gizzard or a bird's gizzard, the bird or the worm or whatever type of animal it is that has a gizzard, instead of using acid to break down the food that they've ingested, they consume their food with some sort of coarse little tiny materials. And then within that gizzard, which is just a muscular organ, the gritty material goes in there with the food, and then the muscles press those materials up against each other, helping to break the food down. So that's the importance of the grit, and that's the reason most people will include it most of the time when it comes to feeding their worms. Now, grit, I believe, does actually come back out of the worm after they've finished digesting their food. So I believe it is deposited within the bin along with their castings. So I always feel like it's in the newest bins where the addition of grit is most important. When my bins get a little bit older, I operate more on the assumption that there's probably plenty of grit in there already and that there's really not that much reason to concern myself about it. But in the early stages of a bin's life cycle, I do like to almost always include grit with my feedings. Okay, so now what I'm bringing over here is my tub that has the finished compost in it, as well as these pieces of paper that we're going to be salvaging from it. And those pieces of paper include a piece of newspaper, and I'm going to shred this paper up too as long as I'm here. It's pretty damp because it's been covered with plastic, so any moisture that may have been trying to escape from that collection of compost never made it out into the air. The plastic that was covering it forced the recirculation of the moisture within the bin. And that's the way I'm going to be preserving moisture within this bin as well, is that at the end, since these containers that I have do not have lids, these types of boxes, although they are available, I don't buy them with the lids, I'll usually cover up in such a way that actually protects the material by resting a piece of plastic right on top of the material. And I believe that the advantage to that is that if you're using something a little bit larger, such as a storage tote that has a lid of its own, and if you're going to be using something like that, then that's fine as well. But then you'll also want to make sure that you've punctured holes into the container to allow for airflow, because sealing up a container entirely and not allowing for airflow can become really dangerous for the worms. If there's no airflow within the bin, then the oxygen levels within the bin can drop to a dangerous level and your worms will suffocate. So I don't use lids, although a lot of people do, but my main reason for not wanting to use lids is because the all that moisture that would evaporate into the air does actually evaporate into the air, and then that little column of air that sits right above the material but is right below the lid itself eventually does start to condensate on the walls. And by having condensed liquid and, you know, basically a layer of dew collected on the walls of the bin, the worms will keep trying to crawl up onto that, and they'll crawl up onto the lid of the container as well. And they'll track their little poop trails all over the place, so you'll end up with a container that's got all kinds of castings stuck around the walls and all over the lid. You might end up with worms that find themselves very close to the opening between the container and the lid, and may even make their way out of the container at times. So I myself don't use coverings in that way. When I cover up to keep moisture in the bin, I do so with something as simple as just a sheet of plastic, usually resting right on top of the material within the bin. and I've always found that to work really nicely. It keeps the worms down within the bin, keeps them from getting curious and wanting to roam around, and also reduces the potential of them of accidentally roaming out of the container by accident. Okay. So I guess the one thing that's actually happening here while we're salvaging all of this cardboard and paper from that old bin of finished compost is that we have actually brought along with ourselves a whole bunch of this finished compost, as well as a lot of this mold that was growing there as well. So right off the bat, here we are. We've got ourselves a container full of a lot of moist, damp materials, as well as a whole bunch of food items, and a whole bunch of microorganisms already within the bin to help occupy the bin and to help kick off the decomposition process. So we've sort of jumped around there a little bit, but now we've actually satisfied every requirement that we had on the list originally. But before we return this tub of finished compost to the shelf, let's go ahead and let's grab a couple handfuls of this finished compost and scatter it throughout the bin. And you don't need much, you know. The stuff will propagate. The microorganisms will make their way throughout the bin and reproduce. And with as little as this much, you've got yourself off to a terrific start. Like I mentioned earlier, if you don't have finished compost like this, if you don't have vermicompost on hand with which to inoculate your bin, or with which to pre-populate your bin with microorganisms and fungi and bacteria and everything like that, you can just go outside into your garden, grab a handful of dirt, sprinkle that inside. It should do basically the same thing, and you'll be good to go. So let's get this out of the way. So we've pretty much made our way through our checklist. Within our container, we laid in some bedding, made sure we added some moisture to make sure it doesn't end up too dry and dangerous. Some food was laid in there, along with some grit to help with the digestion of that food. And in the end, we just dropped in the microbiology to help things off to a good start. But you'll remember, I've still got a few items here on my bench that we need to finish up using. And one of those items is this collection of newspaper. Now I wanted to just talk about the newspaper really quick because a lot of people might question whether newspaper that has colorful inks on it, as you see here, if they're okay, and the answer to that is yes. It's not a problem at all, because all of these inks, as long as they're not glossy, are soy-based. So the worms can certainly consume it along with the paper, and there won't be any sort of a problem. The only type of colorful print that you want to avoid when using newspaper is the stuff that's very glossy. That really glossy ink that you see on newspaper ads sometimes is not soy-based. I believe it does have some sort of materials in it that the worms would not be able to make use of, so those are the sort of stuff that you want to exclude when you're building your bin. So now we've done a pretty good job covering up the majority of the food items that are down there. That's usually my preference, is to try to keep the foods covered, because even though I'm indoors, somehow fruit flies, gnats, they somehow find their way into my wormery, and they somehow figure out that there's food in there. And if it's pretty much exposed on the surface, they're going to be in there and trying to take advantage of it. So I always try to make sure that the food items that are in my bins, whether it's at this stage early in the original build of the bin, or even in the normal life cycle of the bin during routine feedings, I always try to make sure that the food items are sunken down below the surface and covered up adequately to make sure that any sort of passerby insects don't realize that it's there, so they can't catch a whiff of it and come over to get curious about it. So now, since this newspaper is being placed in here dry, I'm just adding a little bit more moisture. And over time, it'll become sort of even. It'll be spread out evenly, so there'll be no particular items that are exceedingly wet or exceedingly dry. The moisture level will sort of level out, and some of the more damp materials, such as the frozen foods that are in here, as they thaw and they start to shed some of their moisture, will transfer their moisture into some of the more dry materials. and the consistency of the material in the bin will level out pretty nicely. So now I've got a few more things that I want to put in here, and one of them is over here. It's this big, plentiful amount of coffee. So I believe that the job that I had given it, which is to try to stain this piece of wood a nice color of brown, is a done deal. So I'm going to drop in all of this used coffee and introduce it to its next purpose in life, which is to be worm food. And the used coffee is just one of those staple items that I'm feeding my bins on a pretty regular basis. So you'll see me feeding coffee almost every time I'm down here in my worm bin feeding. And the other thing that I like about the coffee is that I believe it has a good tendency to sort of mask the odors of the food that's right beneath it. So even though the coffee itself isn't going to attract insects, it somehow prevents the scent of the food underneath from making its way out into the nearby air, and it prevents any sort of insects from realizing that there's even food there in the first place. So now once again, it comes down to personal preference, but when it comes time to topping off, I like to use a sort of natural material as my top covering layer. So here's where I'll resort back to the material that came in second originally, which was the leaves covering up those tubes that had been chopped into little bits. I like the leaves just because it provides a somewhat natural looking top surface. And like I said, totally personal preference. And it might just be a matter of what it is that you have on hand in large amounts. And I've got large amounts of leaves because every time I do my fall leaf collection, I do put a couple of the bags aside, and I dip in there regularly to replenish my supply of leaves that I use down here in my wormery. And I just like the way it looks. And then, like I did before, I'll just try to compensate for the dryness of these leaves by giving them a little shot of water. And what I'll do usually is I'll check back in here after a few days just to see if the water is in fact kind of making its way around the material. I'll sort of probe down into the material to see how the general moisture and dampness of things look. But usually given a couple days, all the moisture that's in the bin will sort of spread out evenly throughout the materials that are perhaps a little bit dry, and everything will sort of start taking on this nice kind of nice damp sort of feeling. And then also during that time, all of those microorganisms within the bin are also starting to churn around within here, starting to break things down, starting to infiltrate the food, starting to make the environment into a really cozy spot. So once the worms get introduced, they're really happy when they land in here, as opposed to being placed into a completely sterile environment. So if you were using a container that was, provided with a lid, you might be putting the lid on at this point. But like I might have mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that you've created some perforations, some holes to allow for some ventilation. Some people puncture the lid itself. In my case, I'm not using a lid. I'll just cover up with usually a piece of paper like this, and then with a piece of plastic bag. Some people use a piece of bubble wrap, whatever you've got on hand, and it seems to work pretty well. A lot of people might question, hey, didn't you talk about airflow and the importance of airflow? It seems like this thing is pretty much covered up entirely. It is, and surprisingly enough, even though it is seemingly covered up almost entirely, it does seem like it manages to get just enough airflow to remain comfortable for the worms. Not to mention the fact that I do check in on my bins at least maybe once a week, once every 8 to 10 days. And at that point, the container is opened up, it lets everything air out. So I'm not sure what the long-term effects of covering up this thoroughly might be if you just place plastic over the top. But so far, I've not had any sort of issues with it this way. So that's it, everyone. I guess I'll just return to the checklist in case you want to get a last glimpse of it. So if you ever wanted to build your own worm bin, it's certainly not complicated. It's pretty straightforward. Getting your hands on worms, that's an easy enough thing to do as well. You can either, you know, go to some sort of a local supplier. Some people get them from a bait shop. Some people go to the sporting goods section of their local Walmart. You can go online, find different retailers online that sell worms. So I recommend it for anybody. It's a great way to get rid of stuff rather than putting it into your trash pail and sending it off to the dump or into the landfill. It's always nice to know that, you know, there's a place to put all your kitchen scraps and compostable materials and get a good second use out of it. Especially when that stuff is finished, your plants are going to love you for it. All right, everyone, that's it for the video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please remember to give me a quick thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. And also, if you haven't done so already, please consider subscribing to the channel too. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone, have a great day. Take care. Bye now.